Everybody can hear me just fine. Hope we're not having a lag or anything. All right, let's do this. The zenith and downfall of a slaver. What's zenith mean? That's zenith. A time which something is most powerful or successful. A point in the sky of... Okay. Can't believe that shit. What a bunch of bullshit. Fuck you, TikTok.
Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum salam. Sorry about that. What kind of shit is that, TikTok? I just went to go look to find a word and definition. God damn. Ugh. So annoying. All right, we're gonna start anyways. Let me get up to Liddy, because that was weird. That was fucking weird, dude. Fuck you, TikTok. Piece of shit. There. Yes, 86. Let's try again, everybody. Let's try this again. Zenith and downfall of a slaver. Catching a slaver in the archival records is no mean task. Indigenous traffickers were influential, smart, and secretive, and they always had justification for what they did. Many of their activities involved labor coercion, but were legal. For example, according to the terms of his royal contract, Governor Carvajal had the power to distribute indigenous peoples in encomendendas to worthy colonialists, whereas in central Mexico, the encomendenda did not amount to enslavement, as indigenous peoples continue to live in their communities, subject to their own authorities, and simply pay tribute to their Spanish overlords. In the North, it was tantamount to slavery, albeit with some particular features. Encomendea owners in the North were assigned bands of hunter-gatherers who, unlike the agriculturalists of central Mexico, had little to give but their labor. To profit from their encomendendas, encomendenderos had to hunt down their entrusted, quote-unquote, indigenous peoples, transport them often at gunpoint, at an estate, and make them work during the planting and harvesting times without pay before releasing them again. This system of cyclic I'm gonna make sure I'm saying this name right. Jesus Christ. Let me try it. Cyclical, everybody. Cyclical. My bad. Cyclical. Moderator. Oh, okay. Yeah. I thought, like, why are you blocking Doodly? Okay. Cyclical. Now I'm going to find it again. The system of cyclical enslavement became widespread and quite characteristics of the encomendandas of Nuevo Leon. Granting nomadic peoples in encomendandas under these conditions was abusive, but it was entirely legal, well within Carvajal's powers. Some of Carvajal's other activities also fell into the expensive the extensive gray area. A good example is his foray onto the Rio Grande Delta in 1585 and 1586. At that time, the mouth of the Rio Grande was a remote region seldom visited by the Spaniards that lay more than 100 miles from their closest settlement. The governor said that he went there looking for a suitable place to establish a fort and to locate a silver-laden ship that had reportedly capsized there. As the Spaniards were exploring the area, quote, a great quantity of Carib indigenous thieves, end quote, came out of the marshes and attacked them. According to Carvajal ad Aventant, his use of the loaded term Carib, end quote, conjuring images of cannibalism, anticipates the tenure of his entire report, quote, and even though he acquired the indigenous peoples to come back in peace, telling them that they would suffer no harm, end quote. Carvajal explains further, quote, they continued to throw arrows at us with undiminished courage, and I took some of these indigenous peoples with their women and children. Governor Carvajal had the power to apprehend indigenous people who had committed crimes and to sell their services to the highest bidder. In the theory, he was adhering to the protocol of waging war on the Chichimecs that had been vigorously discussed and painstakingly negotiated in Mexico City. But the particulars of the case lay bare Carvajal's methods. First, most of the captives were women and children. Second, Carvajal chose not to determine their guilt in the Rio Grande Delta. They were where they were caught, but instead marched them about 125 miles to a newly founded town of Leon, present day Cerravo, where he finally had them tried in March 1586. To be sure, the governor appointed a lawyer to defend the indigenous peoples, but the proceedings were a mere formality. Although some of the males confessed to having committed murder, and the evidence was circumstantial at best for the women and children, Carvajal himself summarized the case against the indigenous peoples this way, quote, these indigenous people had made arrowheads from iron nails and pieces of sword and knives, and these and the other objects may have come from Flemish Carvels, and clearly pointed to their crimes, end quote. In fact, these people lived in a region so distant from any Spanish settlement that it was absurd to pin any crimes on them. And officials in Mexico City estimated that Carvajal's raids on Rio Grande Delta yielded upward of 2,000 indigenous peoples. One of the indigenous peoples captured at the mouth of the Rio Grande was a 13-year-old boy who was given the Christian name Francisco. He had several stripes, tattoos on his hips and chin, and a long line ran from the top of his forehead to the tip of his nose, and there were smaller lines around his eyes. Francisco had been condemned to 15 years of service and assigned to Governor Carvajal, who then transferred the boy to his nephew, Luis D. Carvajal, known as El Manzo, meaning the younger. El Manzo had explored the settled Panaco with his famous uncle and evidently served as his agent, as a, quote, merchant of the mines and other parts, end quote. El Manzo's occupation included the selling of indigenous people. He transported Francisco from Leon all the way to the mines of Zacualpan in central Mexico, where he sold the boy for where he sold the boy for 120 pesos to the miner named Alonso del Nava. Exactly how the governor and his nephew split the money remains unknown. Even more revealing is Governor Carvajal's pacification campaign in the Sierra Gorda. In 15, and again, forgive me for not pronouncing these correctly.
Ready, gift, please.
Yes, please give Fatima if you can. In 1583, he gathered 30, or 40 volunteers, quote, including some of the most delinquent and shady individuals that can be found in these parts, end quote, as they would later be described to the King of Spain to travel to Sierra Gorda by way of, oh my gosh, here we go, the Cazu Catalan. I don't know, maybe I'm saying it right. The Sierra Gorda was extremely rugged region between Panuco and Mexico City, where many indigenous groups had taken refuge and established strongholds. At the appearance of the Spanish forces, the indigenous people immediately sent envoys to sue for peace. Governor Carvajal apparently played his part with a consummated skill. He received the indigenous peoples warmly, begging them to send messengers to other rebels so everyone could receive, quote, authority canes, end quote. Canes given to indigenous people, indigenous leaders to recognize their high standings and take part in the agreement. The governor also insisted that women and children had to be present so that they could be baptized. The indigenous peoples themselves constructed the Enramada, a makeshift church with branches, and arranged a adjacent area with a baptismal font. Everything was set for Sunday, January 8th, 1584. At the 11th hour, the priest refused to go through with the ceremony. He understood that he would be serving as bait for the indigenous people, and reportedly said that it was wrong to deceive God. But it was too late, as the action was later reported to the Spanish king, quote, more than 500 indigenous peoples between men and women came happily and in peace, asking to be baptized, and he, Carvajal, had them maliced and initiated proceedings against them and condemned 8 of them to certain sentences, and all others, without a single exception, were given 10 to 12 or 14 years of service, and they were distributed to the soldiers, separating wives from husbands and children from parents, end quote. By virtue of his appointment as governor and captain general of the new kingdom of Leon, Carvajal assumed a position that was in many ways analogous to the one his uncles D'Arte de Leon had occupied as a royal contractor of, quote, the rivers of Guinea and the Cape Verde Islands, end quote. Both possessed trading monopolies granted by their respective crowns. Both relied on family members to build their networks of agents, and both exploited the availability of human slaves to create wealth. Uncle and nephew developed comparable systems in Africa and America. The notion of a trafficker and his slave network may seem simplistic, but it is critical to understand the reality. I think it's crucial. It's crucial to understand the reality of indigenous slavery, not as a residue of colonial wars, but a transitional phase until African slaves arrived in the New World in sufficient numbers, but as an established network with staying powers in which the host of individuals, for imperial bureaucrats down to the miners, governors, frontier captains, and indigenous allies, had a stake. Carvajal downfall occurred when the intrigued and precision of a Shakespearean play. His activities in Panuco in the 1570s had unfolded at a time when he had enjoyed the support of the Viceroy Enriquez. But when he became governor of Nauvoo, Leon, in the following decade, he operated in a more hostile political environment that culminated in a major crackdown against indigenous slavery. What had been acceptable to one viceroy was entirely out of the question to his successors. During the colonial era, periods of harsh treatment of frontier indigenous people were often followed by attempts at reform. Eventually, Carvajal was caught in one of those cycles. Yet Carvajal's fall from grace did not occur solely because of his slaving. In the course of his career, he had made powerful enemies, willing to use any means at their disposal to stop his ascent. And indeed, they found a very powerful lever. When Carvajal was named governor of the new kingdom of Leon in 1579, he had been allowed to take 100 colonialists and additional soldiers from Spain to Mexico. Ordinarily, royal officials at the powerful House of Trade, the agency in charge of Spain's overseas exploration and colonization, the Surveilli, reviewed the backgrounds of all colonialists bound for the New World to make sure that they were not new Christians who were barred from traveling to the Americas. But in this particular contract, Carvajal was allowed to choose his own passengers and make his own inquiries. It was up to the governor and not zealous crown officials to determine who would accompany him, as long as he made sure that they were, quote, clean persons and not of the forbidden to go to those lands, end quote. In fact, the majority of the 200 colonialists who eventually signed up for Carvajal's, where is no explanation for the discrepancies between these numbers and the number allowed by their contract, hail from La Real de Portugal. Many of them were new Christians and crypto-Jewish people who viewed their journey to the New World as a unique chance to leave Iberia and its religious strictures behind. Moreover, among the passengers were several members of the Carvajal's family, including his sister and her husband, along with their children. One of these children was Luis del Carvajal, who was Sobriquet El Mozo, the younger, distinguished him from the governor, who came to be known as El Vayo, the elder. The evidence suggested that Governor Carvajal himself was a Catholic, but his immediate family was not. All this would come to haunt Carvajal. The first one to be denounced as a practicing Jewish person and tried by the Mexican Inquisition was the governor's niece. At first, she refused to speak, but when she was forced to undress the lie on the torture rack, she could not hold back. When the ropes were tightened with the first turn of the ratchet, Dona Isabel implicated her mother, father, and brother. After the second turn, amid great screams of pain, she imposed all of her relatives as practicing Jewish people. The governor's sister was also tortured. It took as many as 5 turns of the ratchet to break her down, but she too implicated her entire family. Yet the most damaging testimony was that of Luis del Carvajal El Manzo, the governor's nephew and designated successor of the governorship of Nauvoo, Leon. El Manzo had traveled to the New World when he was 13. Together with his uncle, he had explored Panuco and helped establish settlements there. A close bond had developed between uncle and nephew, so close that one night, when Almanzo had gotten lost in Panuco and remained, as he put it, quote, thirsty and disarmed in the land of the Chichimeca, enemies of the fearful and honorable death, end quote. The governor had organized an all-out night rescue. When Almanzo was found, he reported, quote, the happiness and joy of my uncle and those who had stayed behind was great, end quote. Almanzo's parents were both practicing Jewish people, but they had refrained from telling him during his childhood, a practice that was common among crypto-Jewish families to avoid being accidentally denounced. Once in Mexico, however, when Almanzo discovered that he was Jewish, his devotion grew fierce. While in Panuco, he constantly studied the Bible, quote, and learned much while alone in the wilderness, end quote. During his coming and going as the itinerant merchant and while selling indigenous slaves, he came in contact with a remarkable network of crypto-Jewish people. He also wrote a secret diary, signed it, quote, Joseph Lambroso, Joseph the Enlightened. This process of religious self-discovery took a toll on Almanzo's relationship with his Catholic uncle. And at one point in his diary, the younger Carvajal referred to his older kinsman as, quote, that miserable blind man, blind to Judaism, who was governor of that province. Almanzo also resented his uncle's attempt to, quote, marry off the poor orphans, my sisters, or at least bring them into contact with Gentile soldiers or captains, end quote. The Mexican Inquisition found Almanzo's activity disturbing and aroused the inquisitors' suspicions about what Governor Carvajal may have known about the religious belief of his close family members. Yes, please, if you can, please, give to Fatima. Out of respect for his high investitures, they did not subject Governor Carvajal to the rack or to any other form of torture. Although they concluded that he was a Catholic and not a Jewish person, they found him guilty of being, quote, an abettor, or a concealer of heretics, end quote. In the course of his life, Carvajal had been a trading agent in Cape Verde, a frontier captain in Panuco, and a slaver in the New Kingdom of Leon. He must have killed, maimed, and sold into bondage innumerable Africans and indigenous peoples. Yet the Inquisition condemned Carvajal for one of the most magnanimous and courageous decisions of his life, offering passage to many new Christians and crypto-Jewish people who faced uncertain lives in the Iberian Peninsula. Carvajal was banished from Mexico for 6 years for this transgression. It was a light sentence, considering that his nephews, nieces, and sister would eventually be garroted and burned at the stake. Still, Carvajal would not see the light of day again. From his cell at the Inquisition, he was transferred to an ordinary jail to answer to the charges of indigenous slavery. Carvajal was merely one of the several frontier captains who fought in the Chichimeca Wars. His peers included the likes of Dr. Francisco de Sandi, later nicknamed Dr. Sangre, Dr. Blood, who served various slaving grounds, including North Mexico, the Philippines, Guatemala, and Colombia. The Don Gonzalo de las Casas, another memorable man of action, as well as the author of the courageous expose of the enslavement of indigenous peoples, mounting a large horse carrying lances and wearing padded cotton armor, buckskin jackets, and heavy boots, These frontier commanders may seem quaint to us, but they were surprisingly modern in one respect. They were all entrepreneurs faced with the logistic and financial burden of uplifting expeditions into remote regions. Captains had to deal with partners, investors, and soldiers, all of whom were primarily concerned with turning a profit. Their slave-taking enterprises were neither a residue of colonial wars nor a transitional phase until sufficient numbers of African slaves arrived in the New World. Rather, it was a system, one with extraordinarily staying powers, recalling 50 years after Carvajal's inquisitional tribulations by Alonso del Leon, another notable frontiersman and a first chronicler of the new kingdom of Leon. Quote, in those days, we did not consider anyone a man until he had journeyed to the indigenous rancherias, where friends or enemies, and seized some children from their mothers to sell. And there was no other way to sustain ourselves or open new trails without tremendous difficulties. What a bunch of assholes, right? Right. All right. Who's with me still? Got 6 people. Sweet. Chapter 4. The Pole of Silver. The California Gold Rush transformed the western United States. Within 1 decade of James W. Marshall's discovery of a few flecks of gold in the ditch in 1848, some 300,000 migrants who had moved to California. They call it California. These Chinese, Italian, German, Chilean, and other newcomers turned the remote and picturesque Mexican outpost of San Francisco into a bustling port. They also fanned out into the Sierra Nevadas to build cabins, divert rivers, and pan for the yellow metal. This was a familiar story of long journeys, ethnic conflict, broken dreams, and explosive growth. Yet, the California Gold Rush... You want in there? Hold on, let me get the cat in. Hold on. Okay, sorry. Yet, the California Gold Rush was neither the largest metal-induced rush of North America, nor the most transformative. By any measure, the title belongs to the earlier Mexican silver boom in terms of duration. For instance, the California Gold Rush was like a hurricane. Gold production skyrocketed in 1849, but peaked as early as 1852, only 4 years after the start of the rush, and declined markedly thereafter. For all practical purposes, the rush was over by 1865, lasting less than 20 years. The use of pressurized water to wash down entire hillsides, the process known as hydraulic mining, kept gold production from declining even faster than it did. By contrast, Mexico's silver boom started in 1520s and grew through the 16th and early 17th centuries, reaching a plateau at the end of this period. Remarkably, it gained a second wind in the late 17th century and kept increasing during the 18th century, not attaining its high water mark until the first decade of the 19th century, almost 3 centuries after the boom had begun. By then, silver was the principal way in which empires and nations would around the world stored their wealth, and the Spanish peso had emerged as the first global currency used throughout the Americas, Europe, and Asia, where it was often countersigned, authenticated by the treasury or other monetary authorities, and employed in everyday transactions. It remained legal tender in the United States until 1856. All right. Not only did the Mexican silver boom last longer than the California gold rush, but it was more extensive. The gold rush was confined largely to the northern quadrant of the state, with a few additional mines sprinkling along its borders with Oregon and in Southern California. Prior to the gold rush, there has been small strikes in Southern Appalachian, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia. And after the California discoveries, new gold fields emerged in some of the Rocky Mountain territories. Mexico's centuries-long silver boom surpassed these gold strikes in both geographic scopes and sheer density. There we go. Historians usually refer to the mines of northern Mexico, but the truth, the silver boom started in southern and central Mexico. Present-day tourists drive from Mexico City to Acapulco. Still stop at Taxco. 1534, a silver town in Hernan Cortez himself developed. Taxco was part of a cluster of mines in the southern Mexico, and including the Saltepeca, 1530, the Amatec, 1534, the Zacualpan, Caraca, 1540, the Zampango, 1534, and others. Only gradually did prospectors venture north into the lands of the Chechemex along the Pacific coast and up until the escarpments of the Sierra Madre Occidental. They had to bring in indigenous peoples from central Mexico as workers and overcome their tremendous logistical problems, but they succeeded in establishing a string of mines throughout western Mexico. After this initial push, prospectors crossed the Sierra Madre, proceeding on the Central Plateau, where they found some of the richest mines in the world, including the Zacatecas, 1546, and the Guanajuato, 1548. I'm sorry, I'm destroying these names, everybody. But even these mines were not sufficient. Spaniards next explored the present-day state of Durango and Chihuahua, as well as parts of the northern Mexico. Although they found more than 400 mines, 143 in the 16th century, 65 in the 17th centuries, and 225 in the 18th century, scattering through much of Mexico from the subtropical region of the south of the deserts of Chihuahua and from the Pacific to the Atlantic coast. Given its long duration and more extensive geography, is no wonder that Mexico's silver boom produced roughly 12 times as much metal as the 19th century gold rush in the United States. 4.2 million kilometers, 48,722 tons of silver, compared with 3.7 million kilometers and 4,078 tons of gold. This mass production is even more expressive considering the work and danger involved. The gold of California laid the placers, or surface deposits of sand and gravel, which had resulted from mountains eroding and yielding nuggets and flecks of gold, which collected at lower elevations along the hillside and the streams. Mining these bits of precious metals required a great deal of superficial digging, carrying, and washing, as we saw earlier in the Caribbean. That could be very hard work, but it was not nearly as daunting or dangerous as mining silver. Instead of lying in the open air deposits, the silver had to be extracted from deep underground. The main shafts of the mine of San Luis Potosi was 250 yards long. That's in the Valenciani mine of Guanajuato. Guanajuato plunged 635 yards down. When this shaft was completed around 1810, it was considered the deepest man-made shaft in the world, digging in such depths requiring an untold amount of work. And yet this was only the beginning of the long involved process that required bringing the ore to the surface, frequently on the backs of humans, crashing the rocks into fine powder and mixing that powder with toxic substance such as lead and mercury. Oh my God. So a lot of these indigenous folks probably fell prey to getting sick. Jesus Christ. If silver boom had occurred in the 19th century, Mexico would have become the worldwide magnet like California. In an era of newspapers, steamboats, and widespread oceanic travel, there is little doubt that the great Mexican silver mines would have lured immigrants from all quarters of the globe. But because the boom predated these communications and transportation conveniences and unfolded at the time when the Spanish monarchy prohibited all foreigners from going to the Silver District, Mexico had to make do with its own human resources. Whereas California attracted 300,000 people, colonial Mexico had to satisfy a hugely great labor demand with no access to volunteers from the rest of the world. Chihuahua. There is hardly a better place than Parral to explore the pull of silver. Today, Parral is a scraggly town in southern Chihuahua, trying to cope with the closure of its mines after more than 3.5 centuries of uninterrupted production and attempting to weather a drug-related wave of violence that has engulfed such of the state of recent years. Amazingly, it is succeeding by reinventing itself as a tourist destination. Visitors can witness the reenactment of the final earthly moments of the legendary revolutionary leader Pancho Villa, whose car was riddled with bullets at the Parral intersection. Tourists are also encouraged to spend time at the Placicio del Alivardo, and sumptuous late night 19th century house that belonged to a mining baron. But the main attraction is the mine itself. Accompanied by the guide, one can descend to the bowels of the hill, overlooking the Parral, and then wander through the elaborate gallery of tunnels and that were excavated in the 17th century. In colonial times, Parral was neither the largest nor the most productive silver mine in Mexico. It was certainly a major operation compared with dozens of flash in the pan silver strikes, but it produced less silver than Zacatecas, Guanajuato, Pachuca, and possibly some other mines. And yet Parral had a profound influence on northern Mexico's environment, economy, and human population, like Espinola's gold mines, which many have not employed more than 5,000 workers, but were still responsible for the vortex of enslavement and death across the Caribbean basins. Parral became the hub of exploitation. Its spokes and extended far and wide throughout the region and even around the world. It all began in the summer of 1631 when I gotta look up this word, everybody. The Perpatic. I gotta say it. Let me look up this word, everybody. I used a word called peripatetic. Peripatetic. Let's find out what peripatetic means. No, stay on. Peripatetic. Come on. Traveling from place to place, in particular working in or based in various places or relatively short periods. A person who travels from place to place. All right, peripatetic. Peripatetic. I see someone in there. There we go. It all begins in the summer of 1631 when the peripatetic ensign named James Juan Rangel del Basima conducted digging in the hill that he called, quote, La Negrata, probably in reference to the gray-black color of the rock there. Regel del Basima had only recently moved into the region and was a complete novice in the mining business. Less than a year earlier, he relocated from his native of Kalinkan on the Pacific coast with his sister, who had married a encomendero from the Parral area. The 30-year-old took up residence with the young couple at an estate that happened to be barely 2 miles away from the hill, perhaps merely to give him something to do. Regel de Basima was put in charge of a team of indigenous servants whose job was to protecting the silver. From decades, Spaniards had been searching the area, but wars with indigenous peoples, the dense scrub oak, and lack of servants, and simply bad luck was conspired to prevent them from discovering an enormous treasure buried in that hill. Regel de Basima and his team cleared an area close at the top and found that it was completely studded with black rocks. As far as anyone could tell, the vein was enormous and the silver concentration was remarkable. Typically, miners were happy when they found ore contained 1 or 2 micros per quintal. 1 marcos equals 230 grams, or a little over 8 ounces, or 1 quintal of colonial Mexico. Quelled 46 kilometers, or about 100 pounds. Kilograms, sorry, or about 100 pounds. The samples from La Negrata reached 7 marcos per quintal. This was the discovery of a lifetime. Not since the strike of Zacatecas more than 80 years earlier had anyone stumbled on such a massive silver deposit. No single individual, not even one in partnership with the powerful encomendero, who worked the site by himself. So Regel de Basima invited family, friends, and neighbors who claimed mining rights in adjacent areas. Word spread quickly beyond this small circle, and miners from other regions began pouring in pouring into the hill, bringing with them teams of black slaves and indigenous servants. La Negrita soon came to resemble a giant anthill with workers crawling all over it, clearing shrubs, oaks, digging tunnels, and carrying ore. But by the start of 1632, just 6 months after the initial discovery, 400 Europeans and as many as 800 people of service had settled by the hill. Those were heady years when the riches of La Negrita seemed inexhaustible. As one enthusiastic miner put it, quote, "The entire hill is made up of silver." Over the next decade, Parel's population continued to grow in leaps and bounds, surpassing 5,000 in 1635 to 8,500 by 1640. The entire city mushroomed at the base of the hill. Urban centers in Spanish American were usually arranged in a characteristic checkerboard grid, departing from Central Plaza with a church on one side and a government building on the other. Yet Parello, sprouted helter-skelter. The town's houses, initially no more than leather tents, resembled indigenous teepees, were crowded as close to the hill as possible. With the passage of time, this temporary quarters returned into a more permanent jackalous adobe structures surrounded by corrals and vegetable plots. Parel's eastern end was the only section that resembled the real city. The vacant square lots, gradually known as La Plaza del Real, was surrounded by the sturdiest houses, a church, and the principal store. Francisco de Lama, one of Parel's foremost merchants, owned an entire block of those houses opposite the plaza, where he sold overpriced clothes, basic foodstuffs, and occasionally indigenous slaves brought from New Mexico. The captives were auctioned off right in the plaza. In comparison to present-day city, Parel's 8,500 inhabitants may not sound like much, but in the 17th century, it was the largest town north of the Tropic of Cancer in the Americas, and nowhere else in what is now northern Mexico, the United States, or Canada, where there are more indigenous peoples or a large concentration of African slaves living in a single place. Finding silver at Parel was not nearly as difficult as securing the human power to get it out of the ground. Miners were initially attracted by the superficial outcroppings of the metal at the top of La Negrita. But once these easy pickings were dilapidated, they had to dig tunnels following the veins everywhere they led, usually down. Already in 1650s, the shaft plunged 250 feet underground. A nearby mine known as the San Diego de la Masa Nueves was even deeper. The principal shaft of that mine went down 420 feet, more than the length of a football field. The effort needed to make these tunnels is hard to imagine. Workers dug with simple picks, wedges, moils, metal points, and crowbars, toiling from sunrise to sunset. Explosives were not introduced until the early 18th century. Some of the tools weighed 30 to 40 pounds. Merely lifting them was difficult, let alone wielding them for 12 hours or more a day. In addition to being taxing and in the extreme, the work was dangerous. Diggers regularly fell into shafts or were crushed by collapsing sections of the mine. Many more were lost to the floating dust laced with sharp silica. Workers would not help but breathe in these particles, which became lodged in their lungs, causing scar tissue and decay.
The unmistakable symptoms of such damage were fits of coughing, shortness of breath, chest pain, and vomiting. Silicosis would develop within a year and would gradually build up over 5 to 10 years, causing severe scarring of the lungs, low blood oxygen levels, and ultimately death. Digging the shafts was a major undertaking, but it was only the start of the operation. Unlike much of the gold of the Caribbean, which could be collected in flecks or nuggets, silver was mostly embedded in the rock and combined with other substances. This geological reality added immensely to the work that was necessary to extract it. In Perel, as in many other silver mines throughout Mexico, indigenous peoples and black slaves carried the ore to the surface, carrying leather bags full of rocks. They had to crawl through low passages and ascend by means of notched pin logs or chicken ladders. Since the carrier's hands were occupied holding the ladder, the heavy bag, which could weigh between 225 to 350 pounds, dangled perilously from his forehead and was propped against his back. Ore carriers were generally referred to as tenoteros, a name derived from the natural word tenato, I can't say it, in a fiber or leather bag. Needless to say, the danger of slipping or falling was constant. Once the ore reached the surface, it was transported by cart, pulling the mules to any of the dozens of estates devoted to process the ore. In 1633, there were already 22 ore processing estates, known as haciendas de beneficio, in the region. Each of them was a world outside and unto itself. The main work took place on a central patio, where one could see heaps of ore and crews crushing the rock and isolating the silver. Most of the haciendas in Perello used the smelting method. After crushing the ore into coarse gravel, workers shoveled it into blast furnaces and combined it with molten lead. The idea was to give gravity to use gravity to separate the silver from the rock. As the heavier silver, lead alloy sank to the bottom, while the lighter waste product, known as slag, rose to the top and was raked away. Although it was the most common method of processing ore in Perel, it was not the most efficient. The few of the haciendas used the patio process, which resulted in a higher yield of silver. In this case, the ore was crushed to fine powder, spread on a courtyard or patio, and sprinkled in mercury. Water was added to allow the heavier metals to seep to the bottom of the sludge. In Perel, the worst job consisted of walking in shackles over this toxic mud, or in order to mix it thoroughly. This job invariably resulted in serious health problems, as the poisonous metals would enter the body through the pores and seep into the cartilage in the joints. Miners ordinarily purchased convicts who were serving out their sentences to perform this dreadful task at the morterazo, or mortars, where the ore was crushed and processed. The last step of the patio process was to heat the algamen in order to vaporize the mercury and water and leave only the silver behind. Workers involved in this step absorbed the mercury vapors through their mucous membrane, which generally caused uncontrollable shaking of the limbs and death in this little as 2 to 3 years. Security was no afterthought. at these ore processing haciendas. Workers were frequently monitored during their shifts. Moreover, the patios were completely enclosed by a single-story building, which included a chapel, stable for the draft animals and granary, a storage room for the ore and silver, a main house and living quarters for the servants and slaves, many of whom were kept locked up or chained at night. To be sure, not everyone was compelled to work at Parel. As well as we shall see, where there were many salaried indigenous people as well as mestizos who worked alongside forced or semi-forced indigenous people, black people, and half black, half white people. But they used the M words for those people. But compulsion was very much a part of the mix. The work required to dig the shaft and tunnels, carry the ore to the surface, crush it completely, mix it with lead, mercury, and other agents, and recover the silver was prodigious. And that was not enough. That was not even counting the demands on surrounding businesses such as livestock ranches, timber camps, salt pits, and carboneras, charcoal producing fields that supplied the mines with various essential products and required yet more workers. It is no wonder that mine owners complained about the lack of laborers, often claimed that this was the main limiting factor in the production of silver. As early as 1572, the Viceroy of Mexico, Martin Enrique de Alamanza, a capable minister with personal knowledge of the mines of northern Mexico, wrote to the King of Spain and presented the owner's quandary in the remarkable lucid manner. Quote, "For the mine owners, the key is to have workers, and the black slaves are not enough. I have already written to your majesty about the importance of sending indigenous peoples to the mines and paying good wages to them. Many of them go on their own accord and earn enough to eat well, but the natives they use the L word, which we don't like, lazy, sorry, but by nature, and do not preserve in many kind of work unless they are compelled. Without a direct order from your majesty, I do not dare to give indigenous people to the miners because it is a practice that is forbidden, although it would be very suitable." Mine owners went to extraordinary lengths to procure the workers. To get a sense of Parel's gravitational pull, all one has to do is consider its population. Of the 8,500 residents in 1640, about 1,000 were Africans, or half black, half white, slaves. It was easily the largest concentration of African slaves anywhere in northern Mexico. About half of them had been born in the New World and were Hispanicized. The other half had been imported directly from Africa and were primarily from Angola, the major slaving region of Western Africa in the 17th and 18th centuries. As well as from the Congo and as far as Mozambique and East Africa. They had been conveyed through the interior of Africa across the Atlantic, from Veracruz to Mexico City, and finally along royal roads leading to the Silver District of northern Mexico. Hispanicized or not, these slaves were greatly valued by Parel owners. They were dependable, sometimes already possessed mining skills, and since they came from such remote lands, could not run away as easily find refuge in local population. From the standpoint of the owners, African slaves had only one major drawback. They were extremely expensive. Their going rate for a healthy African person or a half black, half white slave in Parel ranged from 400 to 500 pesos, with men condemning somewhat high prices than women, thus suggesting that black slaves were employed primarily in mine-related activities. To put things in perspective, a black slave cost as much as 3 to 5 indigenous slaves. Bishop Alonso de la Mato el Escobar observed that in the mines of Zacatecas, quote, the most difficult job is to dig up the metal and bring it to the surface, because the miners are very deep, and it is the indigenous peoples who do this job, and not black slaves, because it is known from past experience that African slaves get swollen and are afflicted by 1,000 illnesses because of the great cold and humidity of the mines. Bishop Mota Ye Escobar's medical reasoning may have been off the mark, but the observation of black slaves were generally used for above ground tasks, making perfect sense economically. In effect, their high price restrictions the task to which they were assigned. There were also Chinese slaves in Parel. Chinese and was a blanket term used for all Asian people. Although they were never numerous, their presence revealed a network of enslavement and operated across the Pacific Ocean. Nicolas del Tolentino, for example, originally came from an indigenous the Indian subcontinent. I think you're talking about India there. He was variously identified as being from the Malabar coast or the Bengali caste. When he was 12 years of age, Nicholas was sold on the coast of India to a Spanish officer who took him to the Philippines. Once in Manila, Nicholas changed hands until he was acquired by an Augustinian farrier named Joseph Daqui. He kept him for some years. In 1658, Fray Farrier Daqui made the decision to ship Nicholas across the Pacific, entrusting him to a broker who was to sell him in Mexico. At the port of Acapulco, I think it's Acapulco, Nicholas was acquired by an encomendero, resold to a captain from Cuernavaca, and finally transported to Mexico City and onto the northern frontier. When he finally reached Parel at age 28, Nicholas had been an object of a string of transactions throughout most of his life, having traveled immense distances and experienced bondage with masters from widely different cultures. Like their African counterparts, Asian slaves were extremely expensive. When Nicholas was first sold on the coast of India, the Spanish officer paid 50 pesos for him. By the time he reached Acapulco, he was sold for 380 pesos, and in Parel, he commanded no less than 700 pesos. His very presence in this northern mining center, along with that of other men and women hailed from other remote locales, is indicative of the tremendous power of the local miners and their extreme needs for laborers. By fetching such high prices, Africans and Asian peoples could only be a partial solution to this vexing problem. Hold on a second, everybody. The sheer number of indigenous peoples in Parel, speaking different languages and engaging in all aspects of the silver economy, was as impressive as the sight of Africans and Asian peoples. Indigenous people came from all quarters, We may be inclined to think of Parel as a Spanish or a mestizo mining center, but its majority population was the fact indigenous. By 1640, fully 5,500, or almost 2 out of every 3 residents in Parel were indigenous. They could be found all around the town, some as squatters or servants living directly on La Negrita, others locked up at the processing haciendas, and many more scattered at the base of the hill and throughout the mining districts. Indigenous people from some regions became so numerous that they formed their own neighborhoods. One section of the town, for example, was known as the Yaqui neighborhood, for the predominance of the Yaquin indigenous peoples from the Sonora living there. The most privileged indigenous people came from Parel of their own volition to work for wages. Perhaps 2,000 of the 5,500 indigenous people were in this situation. They hailed from more densely populated areas, especially central Mexico, or from more established mining areas. Lured by the glint of silver, they had taken their chances by venturing into the Checamex frontier and accepting dangerous jobs in Parel that they performed for interminable hours. For their troubles, they were compensated with real salaries and, quote, far more important, as Bishop Mota Y. Escobar previously wrote, quote, with silver ore that they got to keep, and which they call themselves Panani, Papane. Indeed, after doing their daily work, free indigenous people were permitted to collect any silver encrusted rocks they wanted. They could then sell these valuable ores in the black market or attempt to refine it into pure silver or on their own. The Pemenia system existed in many mines throughout Mexico and shows that mines owners were willing to offer extraordinary concessions to attract workers. Impressed by the ambiguity of salaries and the penas, some historians have hailed these silver mines as a vanguard of a free wage system of colonial Mexico. Fuck them. Already by the late 16th century, free wage earners outnumbered forced workers in some mines. More recent studies have revealed a sobering reality, however. While salary workers did indeed account for a significant percentage of the workforce in many mines, including 36% of all indigenous in Parel, these workers did not replace coerced laborers, but rather coexisted with them. One reason is that mine owners never fully embraced a labor system that essentially allowed workers to plunder the mines. From the owner's perspective, the incentives were completely wrong. Free workers hid the richest ores, and in order to claim them later as part of their penas, I can't say words, Penenas. They were also prone to drift from mine to mine in search of better conditions. And if they felt the ore was not rich enough or heard about a more promising strike down the road, they had no compunction about packing up at a moment's notice and leaving behind unfinished jobs. Mine owners, therefore, regarded salary work not as an ideal form of labor, but as a necessary evil and a first step towards acquiring a more palpable and stable workforce. One strategy to achieve this goal involved advancing wages in pesos or spice, silver coins, or free workers, Since food, clothes, and many other necessities were outrageously expensive in Parel, and often because of gambling and drinking habits, workers frequently incurred debt. In principle, these were free individuals who had temporarily fallen into hard times. But the reality was more ominous. Unable to repay their debts, these workers could not leave the mines until they closed their accounts. We may think of debt peonage as a phenomenon of great haciendas in the years leading up to the Mexican Revolution. Yet two centuries earlier, indebted servants and peons proliferate in parallel. One minor account books, for example, shows that out of 12 indigenous peoples in his labor gang, 7 of them were in debt. From such scattered evidence, it is not possible to draw general conclusions about the overall level of indebtedness in Parel, and the level of coercion used to get workers to pay. But it is clear that many indebted workers were considered part of the mines, inventors, and more or less permanently attached to them. For instance, when Parel owners put a mine up for sale, they specifically listed the number of indebted workers. Evidently, the existence of such workers was a major consideration for the prospective buyers. Notwithstanding the free or supposedly free workers, some 3,000 of Parel's 5,500 indigenous peoples consisted of forced laborers under the Ecomandia and the repartimento system. There were relatively new encomendantes, indigenous peoples directly involved in Parel's mining economy, as they were mostly set aside for agricultural and ranching activities. The majority of forced workers in the mines and ore processing haciendas came from neighboring communities and missions as part of the extensive repartimento system of forced labor. The system was set in motion when owners requested workers from colonial authorities, specifying the number of indigenous peoples needed and the type of work to which they would be assigned. Governors and local authorities would then work out a number of indigenous workers, both male and female, that each community and mission was required to contribute to meet these requests. It goes without saying that the failure to provide sufficient workers would result in significant repercussions. And as it is easily to imagine, the actual drifting of these indigenous people was a process fraught with abuse that could lead to violence. The fact that local officials were regularly admonished to exercise great caution while acquiring repartimento indigenous peoples suggested that things could easily get out of hand. From their part, indigenous people had every reason to resist. They were forced to abandon their families and leave their animals in fields unattended. They had to travel 20, 50, or even 100 miles to the mines. And although the theory their work stint could not last more than 6 weeks, in reality it could be much longer. The repartimento indigenous peoples were supposed to receive compensation, but their wages were woeful, inadequate, and they were often paid in clothes rather than cash. Indigenous people considered the repartimento system a major inconvenience at best and tantamount in periodic enslavement at worst. Parel's explosive growth in 1630s and 1640s, as well as the mine owners' great need for workers, meant the repartimento indigenous peoples came from a large catchment area and experienced long and more arduous tour of duty. But the late 1640s the strain of the minds of surrounding native communities and missions had become so great that the indigenous people started to revolt. The colonial archives of Parel includes no less than 225 files on sedition, uprisings, and full-scale rebellions from 1633 to 1789. The indigenous people resented the repartimentos epidemics and other problems that stem directly or indirectly from the furious expansion of the silver economy. No historian has delved fully into these files, but even the partial examination of the records for the 17th century revealed that Parel's prodigious growth disrupted indigenous life within the radius of 200 to 300 miles. The wave of indigenous unrest reached the high point in the 1650s when the Tarahumaras, Conchos, and other turned defiant and rendered labor relations extremely volatile. At the same time, Parel's experienced a significant population decline. By 1640, the town had 8,500 residents, but by the 1650s, that number had dropped to around 5,000. Parel's demographic decline was clearly linked to the wave of indigenous rebellions all around it, but the precise causal chain remains murky. The most likely explanation is that Parel's easy silver had been exhausted by the late 1640s, and therefore a higher level of exploitation was required to extract the remaining silver, which in turn prompted the indigenous peoples to revolt. However, it is also plausible that the rebellions around Parel made the recruitment of indigenous workers even more difficult, resulting in fewer people in Parel and less silver. Regardless of the exact sequence of events, mine owners ultimately addressed the problems of insufficient workers by bringing indigenous people to Parel from even further away. Indigenous slaves had been present there since the mine's inception. In 1640, there were about 500 of them, or about 10% of the indigenous workforce. But after the wave of indigenous rebellions in 1650s, miners were forced to rely more and more on these slaves. As we have seen, frontier captains were in the habit of waging war on indigenous or errant nations, accused them of a variety of crimes and convicting captives to 5, 10, or 20 years of forced labor. Technically, these were not slaves, but criminals serving out their sentences. Wonder if we do the same thing here now in the United States. Yet, the technicalities were lost on those who were captured in raids, stuffed into carts, transported over long distances, and sold to the highest bidder in Parel's Central Plaza. Hundreds of indigenous peoples came from the province of Sonora and Sinaloa. These coastal natives were hunted down and transported with great difficulties across the Sierra Madre, incidental to Parel. Other slaves came from large desert regions in the east of Parel, where various bands of indigenous, vaguely known as the Tabosos, both enslaved other indigenous peoples and were themselves victims of slaving raids. The largest stream of indigenous captives poured into Parel came from the northernmost reaches of the Spanish Empire. New Mexico's mining connections. So we're going into New Mexico, everybody. Moving up north, seems like. The conquest of New Mexico is often presented as an incomprehensible story of Spanish cruelty and wanton destruction. In 1598, Juan de Onet arrived there with his men and in short order took possession of this kingdom. Onet appointed indigenous people who submitted peacefully to the encomendants. But he reserved a far worse fate for those who resisted. To this day, New Mexico recalls Onet's exemplary punishment of the indigenous people of Acoma, after their revolt. After they revolted, all males over the age 25 had 1 foot cut off, and this rendered Onet appears as a royal envoy mindlessly expanding the bounds of the empire. Hidden from view, however, are all the mining connections. In truth, Onate went to New Mexico first and foremost as a mining baron. His father, Castubal del Anote, I can't say the name right, had been one of the founders of the silver mines in Zacatecas, and therefore was one of the richest individuals in all of Mexico. Juan de Anet himself was born and raised in Zacatecas and knew all there was to know about silver mining. His stated purpose was in going to New Mexico was to open new lands of Christianity. But his far more practical reason, as well as we shall see, was to prospect the precious metal and obtain indigenous labor. For a start, Onet's expedition was part of the mining rush that was already spilling into New Mexico. At least since the 1580s, mine owners, labor recruiters, and indigenous traffickers from northern Mexico had attempted to tap into New Mexico's population. Little information service about these early Enstradas entrepreneurs engaged in trafficking indigenous people were understandably secretive, but a few extant resources are quite revealing. One young soldier named Diego Perez del Luxen enlisted in a 1582 to 1583 expedition into New Mexico and kept a diary of his experience. He occasionally described how the party ran into a jackal hut along the Conchos River that was very far from any indigenous or Spanish settlement. The Conchos is a tributary of the Rio Grande, just south of New Mexico. This structure, he explained, had been built by a party of slavers the previous years to keep his human quarry. Perez del Lexan knew all of this because he himself was a slaver. Indeed, the following years, our diarist returned to New Mexico to conduct additional raids. We would never have known about these activities had Perez de Lexan not repented of his youthful mistakes later in life, denouncing the quote unjust wars waged against the indigenous peoples and accepted the position of protractor y defensor de los Indios in the mining districts of Santa Barbara, and thriving slave market close to the hill that would later give rise to Perel. Another example of the earlier slaving raid into New Mexico was the one led by Gaspar Gastano del Sosa, the lieutenant governor of the new kingdom of Leon, who took charge of the province after Governor Luis de Carvalho was forced to leave. Castillo del Sosa remained in the town of Almeida with around 60 Spanish colonialists until 1590. His position became unattainable, not only on account of the dwindling silver around Almenda, but also because of the hostility of two successive viceroys, for to escape possible persecution as well as to explore another kingdom. Castillo del Sosa conceived a fantastically bold plan of relocating his entire township from Nuevo Leon to New Mexico. It was the first, albeit unauthorized, European attempt to settle New Mexico permanently, consisting of hardening settlers in uninhabited by the presence of churchmen or royal officials. Castonia del Sosa party spent much of 1590 traversing the parched land of northern Cahula, venturing up the Pancos River and eventually reaching the territory of the Pueblo indigenous people, more than 1,200 miles from Mexico City, and one of the most inaccessible corners of the empire at the time. The viceroy then in charge of New Spain, Luis del Velasco II, dispatched a captain of 40 soldiers to the unimaginable remote locale to capture the renegades and bring them to New Mexico in change. As the members of this second party made their way to New Mexico, they began gathering deposition from some of the Nove Leon settlers who had refused to go with Castillo del Sosa, as well as some of the men who did accompany but were apprehended by the soldiers near the Rio Grande. The processing closed to 80 pages of testimonies and confessions detailing some of Castillo del Sosa's slaving activities. One prominent colonialist named Diego Ramirez Barraveno, Barranavo, was insistence stated that Castillo del Sosa and his soldiers had taken, quote, many pieces of indigenous men and women, all of whom were sentenced to service, and taken out of their land and environment and sold away in other parts. From such disposition, one can only conclude that slave taking had become a significant economic activity in the northmost reaches of the Spanish Empire. Onet's 1598 expedition was the latest bid to integrate the kingdom of New Mexico into a spanning silver economy of northern Mexico. As it turned out, Onet did not find any gold or silver there, but he did find that a number of indigenous peoples living in pueblos or towns was remarkable. New Mexico contained the largest number of sedentary indigenous people north of central Mexico. These pueblo indigenous people, as they came to be known, were surrounded by several nomadic groups with whom they traded. Governor Onet immediately parceled out the pueblos as encomendendes. He was ruthless towards indigenous peoples who refused to submit to his authority, but he was also an entrepreneur. Ooh, we gotta get close. Hold on a second. I didn't realize it was almost 8. Oh no! Oh my God, what number was I on? It was in the 90s, wasn't I? Where was I at? I did it again, everybody. Oh my God, I did it again. Okay, I passed that. God, I hit one of the blue buttons. Okay, that's not. I wish someone would follow along. So I hit one of the blue things and it fucked me over. Does anybody remember what page I was on? Anybody remember what page I'm on? No? Oh my God. The silver. Oh no, you don't remember? New Mexico's, okay, here we go. New Mexico's mining connection. Pueblos. Okay. Oh my God. Can't believe I can't find where I was at. I think I was right here. This page looks familiar. Hold on, everybody. I'm trying to find where I was at. So I hit one of the fucking blue buttons. Okay. Santa Barbara. Okay, I think I read this part. Okay, I think I might be on this. But I'm gonna look ahead. I might have to go over, everybody, just to find a stopping point. People, please remember 107. 107. Oof. Oof. Nope. How far? 6 more pages till I hit chapter 5. Oof. 107. Okay, I'm gonna read 107 and find a stopping point. I'm gonna find a stopping point. He was ruthless towards indigenous people who refused to submit to his authority, but he was also an entrepreneur. His punishment usually tended to be Unitarian. It's not Unitarian, it's in nature. For example, quite apart from the few dozens of indigenous people from Akuma whose feet were amputated. Oh, I read this one. Oneida and the captain sentenced all Akuma males between the age of 12 to 25 and all females over the age 20 to 20 years of personal servitude. Hundreds of indigenous people were thus divvied up among the earliest Spanish colonialists in New Mexico. I think I'm going to stop there. We're going to stop at 107, where it says, there is a little information about the fate. I have to write that down. Let me write that down real quick. Anybody's welcome to come up. What's up? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and these are white conquistadors. These are white Spanish people. All right. Yeah, yeah. It's just more expansion. It's just expansionism. And you know what? Not the funny thing is that when they were talking about that hill, it reminded me of what Frantz Fanon talks about, of how all the indigenous people are in the shanty towns and shit like that to engage into the money economy and stuff like that. So it reminded me of that scenario in Wretched of the Earth when Frantz Fanon talks about that part. You know? And then the different workers that came across, and some of them were like still being exploited, but you know. But then they found ways and loopholes to put them into basically indentured servitude and being enslaved anyway. So yeah, because they put them in debt traps and stuff. You know what I mean? So
Yes.
yeah. All right. Does anybody else have any questions or anything that'd like to come up? Not many people stayed, did they?
Rachel.
Yeah. But if no one else wants to say anything, you have anything else you would like to add? Make sure to put down 107 around here for me, please. And I'm on like the second paragraph. Okay, thank you, thank you. All right, then I think I'll go ahead and close it out unless anybody has anything else to say. Other than that, I think I'll close it out. I appreciate the time and space. I don't know if Chicken Strips or Two Spirit is going live at all tonight, so I guess we'll find out later. All right, everybody, thank you.